The mirror didn't lie, but my stepmother's words cut deeper than any reflection could. I stared at my face, pale, unremarkable, framed by ash-blonde hair that hung limply past my shoulders. Nothing special. Nothing worthy of the mating ceremony that had our entire pack buzzing with anticipation for weeks. Stop wasting time admiring yourself, Iris. There's nothing to see. Veronica's voice slithered from the doorway of our shared bathroom. My stepmother leaned against the frame, her crimson dress hugging curves that had captured my father's attention 3 years ago, shortly after my mother's death. The servants need help with preparations. At least make yourself useful where you can be hidden. I clutched the small wooden pendant hanging from my neck, my mother's last gift, a wolf with its head tilted toward the moon, carved by her own hands during her final days. Be brave when the moon calls, she'd whispered. I'd never understood what she meant. I thought maybe I could attend, just to watch, I said, my voice smaller than I intended. Every unmated female is invited. Veronica's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Look at yourself, Iris. The Alpha King will choose only the most beautiful to consider as his mate. Your presence would be an embarrassment to our family, to your father. Her eyes, cold as river stones, narrowed. We've discussed this already. Your father agreed that you should remain with the serving staff. My father, once the pack's strongest warrior before illness weakened him, now barely raised his voice against Veronica's wishes. Since his fever last winter, he'd grown frailer, more withdrawn, leaving the management of our household to my stepmother, while he served as an advisor to the Alpha. The pendant felt warm against my skin as I nodded, swallowing the disappointment that had become as familiar as breakfast. I'd known this would be her answer. It had been foolish to hope otherwise. Yes, Veronica, I murmured, sliding past her to head downstairs. Our pack lands stretched across valleys and forests, centered around the ceremonial grounds where tonight's gathering would take place. The Alpha King's visit was rare. He ruled over multiple packs across the territory, choosing only to attend the most significant ceremonies personally. Tonight would determine which females would be considered worthy of becoming his mate, an honor that would elevate not just the chosen one, but her entire family. The kitchen bustled with activity as I entered, servants weaving between one another with platters of meat and forest fruits. The air smelled of roasted venison and wildberry wine. No one questioned my presence as I tied an apron around my waist and began arranging flowers on serving trays. I'd always belonged more with the staff than with my stepmother's social circle anyway. They're saying he's brought warriors from his personal guard, whispered Emma, a beta wolf who had been kind to me since childhood. 20 of them, all fierce and loyal only to him. No one's seen the Alpha King in years, not since the war with the Eastern Packs. Is he as frightening as they say? I asked, reaching for another lily to add to my arrangement. Emma leaned closer. They say he has scars across half his face from the final battle, and that he can shift faster than any wolf alive, that he once tore through 50 enemy warriors without help. Her eyes gleamed with excitement. And apparently, he's refused every mating proposal for the past 5 years. Some think he's waiting for something, or someone specific. I smiled politely, but my heart wasn't in the gossip. What did it matter what the Alpha King wanted? Whatever it was, it wouldn't be me. Hours passed as we prepared. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep oranges, Veronica appeared in the kitchen doorway. My stepsister Olivia stood beside her, resplendent in a silver gown that brought out the amber in her eyes. At 19, just a year younger than me, she was everything I wasn't: confident, curvy, with thick dark hair that cascaded down her back in deliberate waves. "You'll serve at the main table," Veronica instructed me, her gaze critical as it swept over my simple work dress. "Stay in the shadows, keep glasses filled, and do not speak unless spoken to. The Alpha King's advisors will be seated there, and I won't have you embarrassing us." Olivia smirked. "Maybe if you're lucky, one of his older guards might notice you, the nearly blind ones." Her laugh chimed, drawing smiles from several kitchen staff who knew better than to side with me over Veronica's daughter. I said nothing, keeping my eyes lowered as I always did. Survival in this house meant becoming smaller, quieter, nearly invisible. The wooden wolf at my neck seemed to grow heavier, as if urging me to stand taller, but years of Veronica's sharp words had taught me the safety of submission. As twilight deepened into true darkness, I followed the procession of servants to the ceremonial grounds. Lanterns lined the paths, and great bonfires burned at the corners of a massive clearing where tables had been arranged around a central platform. Already, pack members were gathering, the unmated females easily identified by the white ribbons tied around their wrists. I carried a pitcher of wine, moving between tables with my eyes lowered, filling glasses without drawing attention. From the corner of my eye, I watched as my father entered with Veronica and Olivia, his arm supporting him as he walked. He'd once been as tall and strong as any alpha, but now his shoulders curved inward, his once vibrant face gaunt and pale. My chest ached seeing him this way. A hush fell across the gathering as horns sounded from the forest edge. The Alpha King had arrived. I'd positioned myself near a stone column, half hidden in its shadow, when the procession entered the clearing. Warriors moved in perfect formation, their expressions disciplined and alert as they scanned the crowd. Behind them walked the Alpha King himself. The gossip hadn't prepared me for the reality of him. Tall, broader than any man I'd ever seen, with dark hair that brushed his shoulders. But it was his face that caught and held my attention. Not because of the scars Emma had mentioned, a single slash that curved from temple to jaw on the left side, but because of his eyes. Even from a distance, I could see their intensity, a pale silver gray that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. He moved with controlled power, every step deliberate, commanding respect without demanding it. The pack alpha, Bernard, stepped forward to greet him with a formal bow. "Alpha King Dominic, we welcome you to our territory and this sacred mating ceremony." The Alpha King, Dominic, inclined his head slightly. "Your hospitality honors us," he replied, his voice deep and resonant in a way that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. The ceremony began with traditional dances, followed by a feast where the unmated females were seated closest to the Alpha King's table. Olivia had secured a prime position, her silver dress catching the firelight as she laughed too loudly at something Dominic's advisor said. My stepmother watched with naked ambition, her hand clutching my father's arm as if she could physically will her daughter into the Alpha King's attention. I moved through the shadows, refilling wine glasses, watching from the periphery as I'd done all my life. The night grew later, the ceremony progressing to the point where each eligible female would approach the Alpha King's table, bow before him, and lower her veil, a symbolic gesture of offering herself for consideration. One by one, they approached. Some beautiful, some powerful in their own right, as betas or alphas from prominent families. The Alpha King received each with perfect courtesy, but his expression remained unreadable, offering no hint of preference or interest. When Olivia's turn came, Veronica straightened in her seat, eyes gleaming with anticipation. My stepsister approached with practiced grace, her steps measured, her smile dazzling as she bowed before the Alpha King and lowered her veil with a flourish. For a polite moment, Dominic studied her face. Then he nodded, the same acknowledgement he'd given every female before her, and Olivia was dismissed to return to her seat. The flash of disappointment on my stepmother's face was quickly masked, but I'd seen it clearly from my position in the shadows. As the last female was acknowledged, Bernard stepped forward again. "Alpha King, these are the unmated females of our pack. Is there any who has pleased your eye this evening?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. The ritual question had been asked, and the next step would typically be for the Alpha King to name those females he wished to consider further, perhaps 2 or 3 who would be invited to his territory for a more extended courtship. Instead, Dominic stood, his silver gaze sweeping the gathering. "I sense there are others present who have not approached." Bernard looked confused. "All eligible females have presented themselves, Alpha King." "No." The single word carried such authority that even I felt compelled to look up from where I'd been carefully pouring wine. "There is another." My breath caught as his gaze moved across the gathering, past the seated females, past the families watching proudly, past the servers and assistants, until, impossibly, it landed directly on me. "Her," he said, pointing toward my shadow-draped corner. The pitcher nearly slipped from my hands as hundreds of faces turned in my direction. Veronica half rose from her seat, her expression twisted with horror and rage. Olivia's mouth had fallen open in shock. "Alpha King," Bernard said carefully. "That is merely a servant girl. She wears no white ribbon," Dominic observed, his voice even. "But she is of age, is she not, and unmated?" Before Bernard could answer, my father's voice rose, thin but clear. "She is my daughter, Alpha King, Iris. We did not think—" "Bring her forward," Dominic commanded, cutting off my father's stammered explanation. Two warriors detached from the king's guard, moving toward me with purpose. I stood frozen, the wine pitcher clutched to my chest like a shield, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. The wooden wolf pendant seemed to burn against my skin. "Be brave when the moon calls." As if responding to my mother's remembered words, I set down the pitcher with shaking hands. The warriors reached me, their expressions impassive as they gestured for me to follow them. On legs that felt disconnected from my body, I walked forward, aware of the whispers, the stares, Veronica's murderous glare. They positioned me before the Alpha King's table. Up close, Dominic was even more imposing, his shoulders impossibly broad, his presence filling the space between us with something electric and unfamiliar. I kept my eyes lowered, aware of my simple servant's dress, my unprepared appearance. "Look at me," he commanded softly. I raised my eyes to his, and the world seemed to still. Something flickered across his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise, before his features settled into that same unreadable mask. "Where is your veil?" he asked. I have none, Alpha King. I was not prepared to participate in the ceremony." Dominic's gaze intensified. "Everyone present knows that is not by your choice." His words carried clearly across the suddenly silent gathering. Before I could respond, he removed the ceremonial cloak from his shoulders, a deep blue fabric embroidered with silver threads that caught the moonlight. With deliberate movements, he draped it over my head like a makeshift veil, the rich material pooling around my shoulders and cascading down my back. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, the Alpha King lifted his cloak from my face. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he studied me. Whatever he saw there, in my unremarkable features, seemed to satisfy something within him. His lips curved in the barest suggestion of a smile. "The ceremony is concluded," he announced to the gathering, his eyes never leaving mine. "I have found what I came for." The silence that followed Dominic's declaration seemed to stretch into eternity. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Somewhere behind me, I heard Veronica's indignant gasp, followed by urgent whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "Alpha King!" Bernard stepped forward, his voice carefully modulated to hide his shock. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private. The girl has not been properly prepared for." "There is nothing to discuss." Dominic's tone left no room for argument, though his eyes remained on mine, searching for something I couldn't understand. "My decision is made." And the weight of hundreds of stares pressed against my back. I could feel Olivia's hatred burning into me, could practically hear Veronica calculating how to turn this humiliation to her advantage. But more than anything, I felt exposed, a creature accustomed to shadows suddenly thrust into blinding light. "May I speak with my father?" I whispered. The question meant only for Dominic's ears. Something softened in his expression. He nodded once, then turned to address the gathering. "Continue the celebrations. I will speak with Iris and her family." His hand, large, calloused from battles I could only imagine, rested lightly at the small of my back as he guided me toward a smaller tent at the edge of the ceremonial grounds. His warriors moved seamlessly around us, creating a barrier between us and the curious onlookers. I clutched the edges of his cloak still draped around my shoulders, drawing comfort from its weight and the faint scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to the fabric. Inside the tent, lanterns cast a warm glow over simple furnishings, a table, several chairs, a map spread across one surface. Dominic gestured for me to sit, then positioned himself across from me, his massive frame making the chair look impossibly small. My father arrived moments later, supported by a warrior who helped him to a seat beside me. Veronica followed, her face a mask of politeness that didn't quite hide the calculation in her eyes. Olivia remained outside, perhaps too humiliated to face the Alpha King after his rejection. "Alpha King," my father began, his voice stronger than I'd heard in months. "This is unexpected. My daughter has not been groomed for such an honor." He glanced at me, and I saw a flicker of something that might have been guilt in his tired eyes. Dominic's gaze never left my face. Why was she hidden? The direct question hung in the air. I looked down at my hands, folded in my lap, waiting for my father's explanation, or more likely, Veronica's carefully crafted excuse. "My stepdaughter is," Veronica began, her voice honey-sweet, sensitive to crowds. "We thought it best." "I asked her father," Dominic interrupted, his tone still calm but edged with steel. My father sighed heavily. "After my illness, I've been less present than I should have been. Decisions about the household have fallen to my wife. I trusted her judgment." He looked at me then. Truly looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. I was wrong to do so in this matter. Dominic nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "You are Robert Blackwell's daughter," he said to me. Not a question, but a statement of fact. I blinked in surprise. "You knew my mother?" "I knew of her. Her skills as a healer were renowned even beyond your pack's borders." His fingers tapped once on the table. "The pendant you wear, it was hers, was it not?" My hand flew to the wooden wolf at my throat, shocked that he had noticed such a small detail. "Yes. She carved it before she died." Dominic's eyes seemed to darken. 3 years ago, during the epidemic that swept through the northern packs. I nodded, swallowing against the familiar ache that rose whenever I thought of her final days. She wouldn't stop treating the sick, even when she began showing symptoms herself. "A true healer to the end," he murmured. Something in his voice suggested personal knowledge of such sacrifice. Veronica cleared her throat delicately. "Alpha King, while this reunion is touching, perhaps we should discuss the practicalities. Iris has had no training in the duties expected of an alpha's mate. She spent her time in the kitchens, not in council chambers. And whose fault is that?" The question was quiet, but cut through Veronica's carefully constructed facade. Before she could respond, Dominic turned to my father. "Your daughter will return with me to the Central Territory tomorrow. As tradition dictates, she will spend 1 moon cycle at my court before any formal mating bond is established." My breath caught in my throat. 1 moon cycle. A chance for the Alpha King to change his mind, to see the plainness and inadequacy that Veronica had reminded me of daily for years. I should have felt relieved at this potential escape, yet something inside me rebelled at the thought of returning to the shadows after briefly standing in his light. "And if, after this time, either of you wishes to withdraw?" my father asked carefully. Dominic's eyes found mine again. "She will be returned with honor and gifts befitting her position. No shame would follow such a decision." I nodded, a small gesture of understanding, though my mind whirled with questions I dared not ask in front of Veronica. Why me? What had he seen when he looked at me that had prompted such a decisive choice? "Then it is settled," Dominic said, rising to his feet. "Iris will need time to prepare for tomorrow's journey. I suggest you assist her." This last remark was directed at Veronica, whose lips thinned into a tight line. "Of course, Alpha King," she murmured, her eyes cold with suppressed fury. As the others rose to leave, Dominic placed a hand on my shoulder, keeping me in place. "A moment alone with your daughter," he said to my father, who nodded and allowed a warrior to help him from the tent. Veronica hesitated, then followed, her back rigid with tension. Once alone, Dominic circled the table to stand before me. I rose instinctively, still clutching his cloak around my shoulders. "You're afraid?" he observed. "Wouldn't anyone be?" I countered, surprising myself with my boldness. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps, but I think your fear is not of me." He was right, though I couldn't explain how he knew. My fear was of hope itself, of believing, even for a moment, that my life could be something other than what Veronica had convinced me it must be. "Why did you choose me?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Dominic studied me for a long moment, his silver eyes reflecting the lantern light. "When you've lived as long as I have, seen what I've seen. You learn to recognize strength where others see only weakness. He reached out, his fingers brushing the wooden pendant at my throat. Your mother carved this with a message, did she not? I nodded, confused by his insight. Be brave when the moon calls, I whispered. Something flickered across his face. Satisfaction, perhaps. The moon has called, Iris. The question now is whether you will answer with bravery. Before I could respond, he stepped back, creating distance between us. Rest tonight. We leave at first light. The walk back to my home passed in a blur. Veronica maintained a brittle silence as we moved through the dispersing crowd. Eyes followed us. Some curious, some envious, some openly hostile. I clutched Dominic's cloak tighter around my shoulders, taking strange comfort in its weight and unfamiliar scent. Once inside the privacy of our home, Veronica's facade crumbled. What did you do? She hissed, her face contorted with rage. What trick did you play to catch his attention? I did nothing, I answered truthfully. I was serving wine, as you instructed. Lies. She paced the entry hall like a caged animal. No Alpha King would choose someone like you over my Olivia without reason. Was it magic? Did you inherit more than just healing skills from your mother? My father's voice interrupted her tirade. Enough, Veronica. He stood at the doorway to his study, leaning heavily on a cane, but with a spark in his eyes I hadn't seen since before his illness. Help Iris prepare for tomorrow, or remove yourself. Those are your only options. Veronica stared at him, momentarily stunned by this unexpected backbone. Then she turned on her heel and stormed up the stairs, leaving us alone. My father gestured for me to join him in his study, a room I'd rarely entered since Veronica took over the household. Books lined the walls, and the scent of leather and paper brought a rush of childhood memories when I'd sit at his feet while he read to me. Sit, he said, lowering himself carefully into an armchair beside the cold hearth. I perched on the edge of the chair opposite him, still wrapped in Dominic's cloak. I've failed you. His words fell into the silence between us, heavy with regret. You were ill, I offered, the excuse sounding hollow even to my own ears. He shook his head. Illness weakened my body, not my eyes or ears. I knew what was happening in this house, and I did nothing. His gaze drifted to the cloak around my shoulders. Did you know the Alpha King's grandfather saved my life during the border wars? I was barely more than a boy, and he pulled me from beneath a fallen enemy. I shook my head, surprised by this revelation. Dominic comes from a line of wolves who see value where others might not. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. Your mother was more than just a healer, Iris. There were things about her, about you, that we agreed to keep quiet until the right time. My heart quickened. What things? A coughing fit seized him before he could answer, his thin frame shaking with the effort. When it passed, exhaustion lined his face. Tomorrow. We'll speak tomorrow before you leave. He reached for my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Whatever happens at the Alpha King's court, remember who you are. Your mother's daughter. My daughter. I helped him to his room, unsettled by his cryptic words, but reluctant to press him when fatigue had clearly overtaken him. Back in my own small bedroom, I carefully hung Dominic's cloak, smoothing the rich fabric with trembling fingers. From down the hall I could hear Olivia's muffled sobs, and Veronica's attempts at consolation. Their pain should have given me satisfaction after years of their cruelty. But instead, I felt hollow. My selection hadn't been due to any merit of my own. Whatever reason Dominic had chosen me remained a mystery, possibly connected to secrets my parents had kept. I moved to my window, gazing out at the full moon that hung low over the forest. Tomorrow I would leave everything I'd ever known, traveling to the Central Territory with a man who was little more than a legend to me. A man whose single glance had somehow seen past the invisibility I'd cultivated for protection. Be brave when the moon calls. My mother's words echoed in my mind as I touched the wooden pendant. Perhaps tomorrow I would learn what she had really meant, what my father had started to reveal, what the Alpha King somehow already seemed to know. Sleep eluded me as I packed the few possessions I valued, my mother's healing journal, a pressed flower from her funeral, a small knife she'd used to teach me basic herb cutting. My entire life fit into a single bag, a fact that should have depressed me, but instead felt strangely liberating. For the first time in 3 years, I was stepping beyond Veronica's shadow. Dawn arrived too quickly, painting the horizon with streaks of pale gold and rose. I dressed in my best clothes, a simple blue dress that had once belonged to my mother, altered to fit my smaller frame, not grand enough for an alpha king's chosen, but at least clean and without patches. A knock at my door revealed Emma, her eyes wide with excitement and disbelief. "They're here," she whispered. "The Alpha King's procession. The entire village is gathered to see you off." My stomach twisted with nerves as I picked up my small bag and Dominic's cloak. Emma stopped me with a gentle hand on my arm. "Wait," she said, pulling something from her pocket, a white ribbon. "You never got to wear one last night." Every unmated female deserves this symbol, especially one chosen by the Alpha King himself. Tears pricked my eyes as she tied it around my wrist, the simple gesture of acknowledgement more meaningful than she could know. "Thank you," I whispered, hugging her briefly. "Show them who you really are," she murmured in my ear. "Not who they told you to be." I descended the stairs to find my father waiting in the entry hall, dressed in his formal pack council robes. Veronica stood beside him, her expression carefully neutral, though I could see the calculation behind her eyes. Olivia was nowhere to be seen. "It's time," my father said, offering his arm for support, though whether he was supporting me or I him remained unclear. Together, we stepped outside into the bright morning light, where Dominic waited at the head of a formation of warriors, mounted on a massive black horse. His silver eyes found mine immediately, and something in his expression, a slight softening around the mouth perhaps, calmed the frantic beating of my heart. "Be brave," I reminded myself as I walked forward to meet my future, uncertain whether I was heading toward salvation or merely a more elaborate cage. The journey to the Central Territory took 3 days, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. A strange suspension of time where each moment stretched with uncertainty, yet passed in a blur. Dominic had provided a horse for me, a gentle dappled mare that seemed to understand my inexperience with riding. I'd never ventured beyond our packlands before, and the expanding horizon both terrified and exhilarated me. My father's promised explanation never came. When morning arrived, he had suffered another attack, his breathing labored, his skin gray with exhaustion. The pack healer had been summoned, and in the chaos, our private conversation was forgotten. His last words to me had been simple: "Trust your instincts." Then Veronica had ushered me out, her tight smile not reaching her eyes as she promised to take good care of him. Dominic rode beside me for much of the journey, though we spoke little. His presence was both intimidating and oddly comforting, a solid, unwavering force that seemed to make the world around us adjust, rather than the other way around. At night, when we made camp, he ensured I had privacy, posting female warriors from his guard outside my tent. These women, fierce, strong, with keen eyes and watchful expressions, regarded me with curious respect that I hadn't earned and didn't understand. On the second evening, one of them, Sarah, the apparent leader of Dominic's personal guard, approached as I sat alone by a smaller fire, away from the main group. "You should eat more," she said, offering a plate of roasted meat. "The Central Territory sits at higher elevation. You'll need your strength." I accepted the plate with murmured thanks, studying her as she settled beside me. Unlike the others who maintained a careful distance, Sarah seemed comfortable in my presence. "You have questions," she observed, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Too many to know where to begin," I admitted. She nodded, unsurprised. "About him? Or about why he chose you?" "Both. Either." I set the plate aside, appetite lost to anxiety. "No one has told me what to expect when we arrive. What will be expected of me?" Sarah considered me for a long moment. "I've served the Alpha King for 15 years. In that time, I've seen countless females presented for his consideration. Noble daughters, pack alphas, warriors with battle honors." She leaned forward slightly. "Never once has he shown more than polite interest. Until you." I shook my head, still unable to comprehend it. "But why? I'm no one special. Aren't you?" Her gaze drifted to the wooden pendant at my throat. Your mother was Helen Blackwell, wasn't she? The healer who saved hundreds during the Northern epidemic? Yes, but... And died in the process, Sarah finished, her voice softening. Dominic never forgets a sacrifice made for the welfare of the packs. Your mother's name is honored in the Central Territory. The revelation stunned me into silence. My mother, honored in territories she'd never visited, it made no sense. She had been our pack's healer, important to us, but hardly known beyond our borders. Before I could press further, Sarah rose to her feet. Rest well, Iris. Tomorrow we cross into the Central Territory. The mountains can be disorienting for first-time visitors. She left me with more questions than answers, and sleep came fitfully that night, my dreams filled with fragmented images of my mother mixing healing herbs, whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. The third day of travel brought us to the base of mountains that seemed to touch the clouds themselves. The air grew cooler, sharper, carrying the scent of pine and something else, a wildness that called to something deep inside me. As we began the ascent along narrow trails, the warriors spread out in protective formation, their senses clearly alert for potential threats. The border is just ahead, Dominic said, guiding his horse alongside mine. What you feel is the barrier. I glanced at him, surprised. You can tell what I'm feeling? A hint of a smile touched his lips. Your pulse has quickened. Your scent has changed. When I flushed with embarrassment, he added, The barrier affects everyone this way the first time. It's magic woven by the first Alpha Kings to protect our central lands. Magic. The word hung between us, taboo in many packs where such powers were feared. My mother had been careful when using her healing gifts, never calling attention to the fact that her remedies worked better, faster than traditional medicine alone. Is it safe to cross? I asked, glancing ahead at the seemingly ordinary mountain pass. Dominic's expression darkened slightly. For those invited, yes. For others, the experience can be unpleasant. Before I could ask what he meant, a strange pressure began building in my ears. As if I'd plunged underwater, the air around us seemed to thicken, shimmering like heat waves above summer rocks. My mare snorted nervously, and I gripped the reins tighter, fighting a momentary wave of dizziness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure vanished. The world around us transformed, the trees taller, the colors more vivid, the very air seeming to pulse with energy. We emerged onto a wide plateau overlooking a valley that took my breath away. A river wound like a silver ribbon through lush forests, and nestled against the mountainside stood a sprawling structure of stone and wood that could only be the Alpha King's stronghold. Welcome to Ravencrest, Dominic said, watching my reaction closely. Your new home. The word home caught in my chest. I'd never truly had one, not since my mother died and Veronica transformed our house into a place of quiet hostility. Could this imposing fortress ever feel like somewhere I belonged? As we descended into the valley, people emerged from smaller settlements scattered throughout the forest. They lined the road, watching our procession with undisguised curiosity. Their whispers reached my ears, speculation about who I was, why the Alpha King had returned with an unknown female from a minor pack. The closer we drew to Ravencrest, the larger it loomed. Not a single structure as I'd first thought, but a complex of buildings centered around a massive great hall. Stone towers rose at strategic points, and I could see warriors patrolling the walls, their attention focused outward toward the valley and mountains beyond. It was built by the first Alpha King, Dominic explained, noting my wide-eyed assessment. Each generation has added to it. The eastern wing is mine. A welcoming party waited in the courtyard as we rode through the massive gates, elders, advisors, and servants arranged in careful formation. At their center stood a woman who commanded attention despite her small stature. Her silver-streaked dark hair was pulled back in an elaborate braid, and her posture radiated authority. Dominic dismounted first, then came to help me from my horse. His hands at my waist were steady, strong, lifting me as if I weighed nothing. For a brief moment, we stood close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the flecks of darker gray in his silver eyes. Then he stepped back, his expression returning to the careful neutrality he maintained in public. Grandmother, He greeted the silver-haired woman, inclining his head with genuine respect. May I present Iris Blackwell, daughter of Jonathan and Helen Blackwell of the Northern Crescent Pack. The woman, Dominic's grandmother, approached with measured steps, her keen eyes assessing me with an intensity that made me fight the urge to shrink back. Helen's daughter, she murmured, more to herself than to me. I see it now. The resemblance is subtle but unmistakable. She extended her hands, and instinctively, I placed mine in hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her palms marked with calluses that spoke of a life lived through action rather than leisure. I am Lydia, elder of the Central Council, she introduced herself. My grandson has chosen boldly, it seems. Something in her tone suggested this was typical of Dominic, and I caught the barest hint of exasperated affection beneath her formal words. Come, she said, releasing my hands. You must be exhausted from your journey. We've prepared rooms for you in the East Wing, near my grandson's quarters. As we entered Ravencrest, I felt eyes on me from all directions. Servants paused in their duties. Advisors studied me with calculated interest. Warriors tracked my movements with professional assessment. I clutched my small bag closer, acutely aware of my simple blue dress and travel-worn appearance among such grandeur. The wooden wolf pendant felt like the only real thing in this dreamlike situation. The interior of Ravencrest was a contrast of rugged strength and unexpected beauty. Massive wooden beams supported high ceilings, while intricate tapestries depicting pack history softened the stone walls. Lanterns cast a warm glow over polished floors, and somewhere, I could hear the gentle splash of an indoor fountain. Lydia led us through corridors that turned and branched in confusing patterns until we reached a heavy wooden door carved with a pattern of wolves running beneath a crescent moon. Your quarters, she announced, pushing the door open to reveal a suite of rooms that dwarfed my entire living space back home. My grandson thought you might appreciate the northern symbolism. She gestured toward the carved door. The crescent moon represents your home pack. I stepped inside, overwhelmed by the space, a sitting room with comfortable furniture arranged before a fireplace, doorways leading to what appeared to be a bedroom and private bathing chamber, and tall windows overlooking the forest below. Everything spoke of comfort and quality without ostentation. I'll send Mira to assist you, Lydia continued. She'll help you settle in and explain the daily routines of Ravencrest. Thank you, I managed, my voice sounding small in the large space. Dominic had remained silent throughout this exchange, but as Lydia prepared to leave, he finally spoke. Iris will join us for the evening meal. Please ensure the council is present. Lydia arched an eyebrow but nodded. As you wish. With a final assessing glance at me, she departed, leaving Dominic and me alone for the first time since our brief conversation in the tent. He moved farther into the room, his massive frame making the space feel suddenly smaller. These were my mother's rooms before she passed, he said, his voice softer than I'd heard it before. I thought you might be comfortable here. The revelation that he'd placed me in rooms of such personal significance stunned me. I don't understand any of this, I admitted, the words escaping before I could stop them. Dominic turned to face me fully, his silver eyes intent. What don't you understand, Iris? Why me? The question burst from somewhere deep inside, fueled by days of confusion and years of being told I was nothing special. Of all the females you could have chosen, beautiful ones, powerful ones, why select someone your advisors clearly think is beneath you? Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at my directness, or at the emotion behind my words. Is that what you believe? He asked quietly. That you are beneath me? I gestured helplessly at myself, at my simple clothes and unremarkable appearance. Look at me. Then look at this place, at your position. What else could anyone think? Dominic closed the distance between us in 2 strides, stopping just short of touching me. His presence enveloped me, not threatening, but impossible to ignore. I look at you, Iris Blackwell, and I see exactly what I've been searching for. His voice had dropped lower, resonating in a way that seemed to vibrate through my chest. The daughter of a woman brave enough to sacrifice herself for others. A survivor who has endured years of cruelty without letting it twist her spirit. His hand rose slowly, giving me time to retreat if I wished, before his fingers brushed the wooden pendant at my throat. And the bearer of a legacy far more significant than you realize. The touch sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with fear. What legacy? Before he could answer, a soft knock interrupted us. Dominic stepped back immediately, his expression closing off as the door opened to reveal a young woman carrying fresh linens. "Mira will help you prepare for dinner," he said, his formal tone returning. "We'll continue our conversation another time." With a slight bow of his head, he departed, leaving me with more questions than ever, and a lingering warmth where his fingers had brushed my skin. Mira proved to be efficient, and thankfully not overly curious about my sudden appearance at Ravencrest. As she helped me bathe and dress in clothes she'd brought, simple but finely made garments that fit better than anything I'd worn in years, she explained the basic layout of the stronghold and the routines that governed life there. "The Alpha King rises before dawn and trains with his warriors," she told me as she brushed my damp hair. "The council meets mid-morning. Afternoons are for petitioners from throughout the territory. Evenings." She hesitated. "Yes?" I prompted. "Evenings are usually private," she finished. "The Alpha King rarely dines with the council unless there's official business. Tonight is unusual." I caught her meaning clearly. My presence had disrupted normal patterns. Whether that disruption was welcome remained to be seen. As dusk settled over Ravencrest, Mira led me through the maze of corridors to the great hall where dinner would be served. The massive space was dominated by a long table positioned on a slightly raised platform, with smaller tables arranged throughout the room. Already, council members and other high-ranking pack members had gathered, their conversation creating a low hum that quieted noticeably as I entered. Dominic sat at the center of the main table, his grandmother to his right. The empty seat to his left clearly awaited me. With Mira's gentle urging, I moved forward, conscious of every eye tracking my progress. The blue dress Mira had selected suddenly felt inadequate, despite being finer than anything I'd owned before. As I approached, Dominic rose, a gesture that prompted everyone else to stand as well. The sudden silence was deafening as I took my place beside him, heart hammering so loudly I was certain everyone with enhanced hearing could detect it. "Tonight," Dominic's voice carried effortlessly throughout the hall, "we welcome Iris Blackwell of the Northern Crescent Pack, daughter of Jonathan and Helen Blackwell." Murmurs rippled through the gathering at my mother's name, confirming what Sarah had told me. Somehow my mother was known here. "As tradition dictates," Dominic continued, "Iris will remain at Ravencrest for 1 moon cycle, during which time she will learn our ways, and we will have the honor of knowing her." His hand came to rest lightly on the back of my chair. "I expect her to be treated with the respect due to one I have personally chosen." The unspoken warning in his words was clear, and I saw several council members exchange glances. As everyone retook their seats, servers appeared with platters of food and pitchers of wine. The familiar routine of serving a meal provided momentary comfort. At least this was something I understood, even if I was now on the receiving end, rather than the one carrying trays. "Tell me, Iris." Lydia spoke from across Dominic, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby council members to hear. "Did your mother teach you her healing arts before she passed?" The question seemed innocent enough, but I sensed layers beneath it. "Some basic skills," I answered carefully. "Identifying herbs, preparing simple remedies, and the more advanced techniques." Her gaze was penetrating, searching for something specific. I hesitated, remembering how my mother had always been cautious about displaying the full extent of her abilities. "We didn't have time for those lessons," I said finally, the old grief catching in my throat. Lydia nodded, as if my answer confirmed something, a shame. Her knowledge was unique. Before I could ask what she meant, an advisor further down the table spoke up. "Forgive my directness, Alpha King, but is it wise to bring an untrained female from a minor pack into Ravencrest at such a delicate time? The southern territories grow more restless by the day." Dominic's expression didn't change, but I felt a subtle tension enter his body beside me. "Are you questioning my judgment, Counselor Harris?" The man paled slightly. "No, Alpha King. Merely expressing concern for the girl's safety should matters with the southern packs escalate." "Iris is exactly where she needs to be," Dominic replied, his tone ending further discussion on the matter. The remainder of the meal passed in a blur of careful conversation and scrutiny from all sides. I answered questions about my pack, my father's health, my limited education as politely as possible, all while sensing the undercurrents I couldn't fully understand. When dinner finally concluded, Dominic escorted me personally back to my quarters, his warriors following at a discreet distance. "You did well," he said as we walked. "The council is naturally suspicious of outsiders. They think I'm a liability," I observed, "because of the situation with the Southern Territories, whatever that means." Dominic glanced down at me, a hint of approval in his expression. "You listen carefully. Good." He paused outside my door. "The Southern packs have been pushing against our borders for months. Their new leader, Valen, believes he should rule all territories. And bringing me here in the middle of this conflict was wise because—" The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Because, Iris Blackwell, some conflicts require more than just warriors and weapons to resolve." His gaze dropped to the wooden pendant at my throat. "Sometimes they require exactly what your mother left to you." And before I could demand clarification, he stepped back with a formal nod. "Rest well. Tomorrow, your true education begins." As I closed the door behind me, I pressed my fingers to the wooden wolf, my mother's final gift. Be brave when the moon calls. The pendant seemed to warm beneath my touch, and for the first time, I wondered if the words had been more than just a mother's encouragement, if perhaps they had been a prophecy or even instructions for a future she wouldn't live to see. Days at Ravencrest fell into a rhythm I never expected to find comforting. Each morning, Mira would wake me before dawn, helping me dress in the practical but finely made clothes that had mysteriously appeared in my wardrobe. Then, instead of joining the servants in the kitchen as I would have back home, I found myself in lessons, some with Lydia, who taught me the complex political relationships between the territories. Others with various council members who seemed determined to cram years of education into weeks. Most surprising were my afternoons with Sarah, who took me to a secluded training yard where female warriors practice combat techniques. "The Alpha King insists," she'd explained on our first day, tossing me a wooden practice sword that I'd fumbled to catch. "Every female in his household must know how to defend herself." I'd been abysmal at first, my body unused to the demands of training. But there was something freeing about the physical exertion, the focus required to block Sarah's measured attacks, the satisfaction when I occasionally managed to execute a move correctly. Each evening, I collapsed into bed with muscles aching in ways I'd never experienced, yet I slept more soundly than I had in years. Dominic himself remained an enigma. I saw him daily, at meals, in passing through corridors, occasionally observing my training from a distance. But our interactions remained formal, watched by too many curious eyes for the personal conversation he'd promised. The questions continued to build within me, about my mother, about the legacy he'd mentioned, about why he'd really chosen me. A week into my stay, I discovered the library, a vast room lined with shelves that reached the ceiling, filled with more books than I'd ever seen. Hidden behind a section on pack histories, I found a smaller collection of texts on healing arts, some so old their bindings cracked when I carefully opened them. It was there, tucked away among ancient knowledge, that I felt closest to my mother. Her own small collection of healing books had been accidentally destroyed in a kitchen fire shortly after Veronica moved in. These volumes contained similar information, but went deeper, describing techniques my mother had only hinted at in her final days. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after my arrival, I was absorbed in a particularly interesting text about energy manipulation and healing when a shadow fell across the page. "I wondered how long it would take you to find this section," Dominic said, his voice startling me from my concentration. I looked up to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between satisfaction and concern. He wore simpler clothes than usual, dark trousers and a loose shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with the scars of past battles. "It reminds me of my mother," I admitted, closing the book carefully. He nodded, then gestured to the space beside me on the window seat. "May I?" When I nodded, he settled next to me, his larger frame making the previously spacious seat feel suddenly intimate. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering against the glass and creating a sense of isolation from the rest of Ravencrest. "You've been patient," he observed. waiting for explanations, I promised. "I've had plenty to occupy me," I replied, though we both knew my lessons, while informative, had carefully avoided the topics that mattered most. Dominic's gaze dropped to the book in my lap. "What have you learned from your reading?" I hesitated, unsure how to articulate the connections I'd been making between these ancient texts and my own experiences. These books describe healing techniques that go beyond herbs and bandages, ways of channeling energy to mend injuries that should be fatal. I glanced up at him. My mother could do that, couldn't she? That's why her name is known here. He nodded, a hint of approval warming his expression. Helen Blackwell was born in the Central Territory, though few know that history. She was sent to your pack as part of an alliance during the border wars, where she met your father. The revelation stunned me. She never mentioned being born here. For her protection. And yours. Dominic shifted slightly, turning more fully toward me. Your mother was the last known healer with the true gift, the ability to transfer life energy from herself to others. It made her uniquely valuable. And uniquely vulnerable. A memory surfaced. My mother, pale and swaying after treating a severely injured warrior. My father rushing to steady her as if he'd expected the collapse. At the time, I'd attributed her weakness to long hours and lack of sleep during a crisis. Now, I understood it had been something more profound. The epidemic that killed her, I said slowly. She wasn't just treating the sick with herbs, was she? Pain flickered across Dominic's face. No, she was literally giving her life to save others, a little at a time, until there was nothing left to give. The knowledge settled heavily in my chest. Not just grief for my mother, but a new understanding of her sacrifice. And you believe I inherited this gift? I know you did. His certainty was startling. The pendant she carved for you. It's not just wood, Iris. It's a conduit, designed to help you control abilities that would otherwise manifest unpredictably. My fingers went instinctively to the wooden wolf at my throat, but I've never healed anyone. I would know if I had this power. Would you? Dominic's voice was gentle. Think carefully. Has there never been a time when someone recovered more quickly than expected under your care? When you touched someone in pain and felt a strange sensation pass between you? I thought of my father after his fever. How the pack healer had been certain he wouldn't last the night. How I'd sat beside him, holding his hand, willing him to live with every fiber of my being. How the next morning, his fever had broken, and I'd been so exhausted I could barely stand. Even if that's true, I said, trying to process this revelation. Why does it matter so much that you would seek me out? There must be other healers. Dominic was silent for a long moment, his expression growing more somber. What do you know of the conflict with the Southern Territories? The abrupt change of subject caught me off guard. Only what I've gathered from council meetings. Their leader, Valen, wants to unify all territories under his rule. There have been border skirmishes, some talk of impending war. What you haven't heard, Dominic said, his voice dropping lower, is that Valen possesses an ability opposite to yours. Where true healers can transfer life energy to save others, he can drain it to strengthen himself. A chill ran through me despite the room's warmth. That's possible? It's forbidden knowledge, practiced in secret by those willing to sacrifice others for power. Valen has grown stronger by taking the life force of his enemies and increasingly innocent victims from border villages. The horror of it turned my stomach. And you think I can... What? Stop him somehow? Dominic's silver eyes held mine. I believe you represent balance. His power destroys, yours heals. The ancient texts speak of such pairs throughout our history, dark and light, death and life, always in opposition, always seeking equilibrium. Rain lashed harder against the windows, punctuating the gravity of his words. Beyond the library's walls, thunder rumbled in the distance. Is that why you chose me? The question emerged quieter than I intended. As a weapon against Valen, something shifted in Dominic's expression. A softening around his eyes, a tension in his jaw. I chose you because the moment I saw you standing in the shadows at that ceremony, something inside me recognized what everyone else had overlooked. Strength, resilience, a spirit unbroken despite years of being told you were nothing. He reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on the book. The fact that you may be our best hope against Valen's darkness is significant. Yes, but never think that is the only reason you are here. The warmth of his hand against mine sent a current of awareness through my body that had nothing to do with healing powers or ancient prophecies. For a breathless moment, the rain and thunder outside faded to background noise as his silver gaze held mine. A loud crash from somewhere in the corridor broke the spell. Dominic withdrew his hand, rising to his feet in one fluid motion as the library door burst open. Sarah appeared, her expression taut with urgency. "Alpha King," she said, offering a quick bow. "Forgive the interruption. We've received word from the border. 3 villages have been attacked. There are survivors being brought to Ravencrest now." Dominic's entire demeanor shifted, the momentary softness replaced by the commanding presence of the Alpha King. "Prepare the healing chambers. Alert the council." As Sarah departed, he turned back to me. "Iris, I would not ask this of you if there were any other option. The injured will need help beyond what our conventional healers can provide." Understanding dawned with a mixture of fear and determination. "You want me to try to heal them, using whatever gift I might have. Only if you're willing." Despite the urgency of the situation, his voice remained steady. "This isn't something I can order you to do." I thought of my mother, giving everything she had to save others. Of the wooden pendant she'd left to guide me. Of the villagers, innocent victims in a power struggle they likely barely understood. "I'll try," I said, rising to my feet, "but I don't know how to control it. What if I fail?" Dominic's hand came to rest on my shoulder, solid and reassuring. "You are Helen Blackwell's daughter. Trust the instincts she gave you." An hour later, I stood in Ravencrest's healing chambers, a large room lined with beds where the injured were being brought in a steady stream. The sense of blood and fear filled the air, undercut by the sharp tang of medicinal herbs as healers moved between the wounded, doing what they could with conventional methods. My hands trembled as I approached the first bed, where a young woman lay unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin gray beneath a hasty bandage that couldn't contain the severity of her wound. A healer looked up at me with skepticism. "Counselor Lydia said you might be able to help," he said, doubt evident in his tone. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and reached out to touch the woman's forehead. Her skin felt cold, clammy, life slipping away with each labored breath. I closed my eyes, trying to recall what I'd read in the ancient texts. They had spoken of visualizing energy flowing from healer to patient, of opening oneself as a conduit for life force. Nothing happened. Panic began to rise in my throat. What if Dominic was wrong? What if I didn't possess my mother's gift after all? People were dying while I stood helplessly by their bedsides, a fraud who couldn't deliver the miracle they needed. A presence appeared beside me, Lydia, her expression grave, but her eyes kind as she took in my distress. "The pendant," she said softly, nodding toward the wooden wolf at my throat. "Hold it while you work. It will help focus your energy." I clutched the carving, feeling its familiar contours against my palm. "Be brave when the moon calls." My mother's words echoed in my mind as I placed my other hand on the wounded woman's shoulder and closed my eyes again. This time, I felt something. A warmth starting in my chest, flowing down my arm, into my fingers. The wooden wolf grew hot against my skin. Almost uncomfortably so. A strange tingling sensation spread through my body, followed by a sudden weakness that made me sway on my feet. When I opened my eyes, the woman's color had improved, her breathing deeper and more regular. The healer was staring at me in shock, his fingers pressed to her wrist to check her pulse. "Impossible," he whispered. Her heart was failing. I didn't wait to hear more, already moving to the next bed where an elderly man lay with burns covering his arms. Again, I felt the flow of energy from my body to his, the wooden pendant guiding and focusing what would otherwise have been chaotic power. Each healing left me weaker, yet there was a fierce joy in watching color return to ashen faces, in feeling wounds knit beneath my touch. By the 6th patient, my vision had begun to blur at the edges. My legs felt unsteady, and a cold sweat had broken out across my forehead. Still, I pushed on to a 7th, then an 8th. The pendant burned against my skin, almost as if warning me to stop, but the sight of so many injured drove me forward. The 9th patient was a child, no more than 7 years old, with a wound to his chest that had the healers shaking their heads in resignation. Something in me refused to accept his fate. I placed both hands on his small body, channeling everything I had left into healing him. The room began to spin. Darkness encroached on my vision, narrowing to a single point of light. I felt myself falling, heard distant voices calling my name, and then nothing. I awoke to the sensation of fingers stroking my hair back from my forehead. Opening my eyes required monumental effort, as if my eyelids had been weighted with stones. When I finally managed it, I found Dominic seated beside my bed, concern etched deeply into his features. "How long?" My voice emerged as a cracked whisper. 2 days, he answered, his hand stilling against my temple. "You nearly died, Iris." The memory of the healing chambers flooded back. The injured villagers, the flow of energy from my body to theirs, the child with the chest wound, the boy. I managed to ask, "Did he?" "He lives." As do all the
Dominic's
others you
expression
touched. Held a mixture of awe and distress. 9 people who should have died are now recovering, thanks to you. Relief washed through me, followed by a bone-deep exhaustion, unlike anything I'd experienced before. I couldn't stop, I admitted. Once I started, I couldn't bear to watch anyone suffer if I could help. Dominic's jaw tightened. "You have your mother's heart," and nearly shared her fate. His hand moved from my temple to grasp mine, his grip almost painfully tight. "You must learn to limit yourself, Iris, to recognize when you've given enough." I wanted to argue, but even the effort of keeping my eyes open was becoming too much. As darkness began to claim me again, I felt the press of something against my forehead. Dominic's lips, warm and gentle, bestowing a blessing, or perhaps a promise. "Rest." His voice followed me into sleep. "I'll be here when you wake." The next time I opened my eyes, sunlight streamed through windows I didn't recognize. I lay in a massive 4-poster bed in a room far grander than the one I'd been given upon arrival at Ravencrest. Rich tapestries adorned the walls, and a fire crackled in a stone hearth despite the warm day outside. I pushed myself up against the pillows, surprised to find my strength returning more quickly than seemed possible after what I'd experienced. The door opened, and Lydia entered, carrying a tray with a steaming cup and bowl. "Awake at last," she said, her usual briskness tempered with something that might have been respect. "How do you feel?" "Better than I should," I answered honestly. She nodded, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Dominic has been sharing his strength with you. An alpha can do that, in small amounts, to help those under their protection recover. The thought of Dominic giving me his own energy, after I'd depleted mine saving others, created a complex emotion I couldn't immediately name. "Where am I?" I asked, looking around at the unfamiliar chamber. "The Alpha King's personal quarters," Lydia replied, her expression revealing nothing. "He insisted you be moved here where he could monitor your recovery himself." Before I could process this information, the door opened again, and Dominic himself entered. He looked tired, with shadows beneath his eyes suggesting he'd slept little during my recovery. But his face brightened visibly when he saw me sitting up. "You should be resting," he said, though there was no reproach in his tone. "I've rested enough," I countered. "What happened while I was unconscious? The villagers, the attacks?" Lydia exchanged a glance with her grandson. "I'll leave you to explain," she said, moving toward the door. Before exiting, she paused beside me. "What you did was extraordinary, Iris. Your mother would be proud." When we were alone, Dominic took the chair beside the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "The council has been in session almost continuously since the attacks," he said. "What happened to those villages was a message, from Valen, directly to me." "What kind of message?" His expression darkened, the kind written in innocent blood. "His forces didn't just attack the villages, they drained the life from dozens before our patrols could drive them back." Horror washed through me. Why would he do something so monstrous? "Because he knows you're here." Dominic's voice dropped lower. "Somehow he's learned that I've found a true healer." The balance to his destruction. The weight of this knowledge pressed against my chest. He's afraid of what I might do. He should be. Dominic's eyes gleamed with something fierce. What you did in the healing chambers has already spread throughout Ravencrest and beyond. The people are calling you the Alpha's healer. Some say you're the fulfillment of an old prophecy about light returning to the territories in their darkest hour. I shook my head, overwhelmed by such expectations. I'm just one person. I nearly died healing 9 people. How could I possibly stand against someone who has killed dozens? Dominic reached for my hand, his larger one enveloping mine completely. You won't face him alone, Iris. I swear it. His thumb traced small circles against my palm. The council has voted unanimously to offer you permanent protection within Ravencrest, not as a guest, but as a formal member of the Central Pack. The implication hung in the air between us. The only way for me to join the Central Pack officially would be through mating, to Dominic or another high-ranking wolf. The traditional 1-month period isn't complete, I said carefully, trying to read his expression. No, and I won't rush your decision. His hand tightened around mine, but things have changed since you arrived. Valen's attacks have accelerated his timeline, and ours. Outside, clouds passed over the sun, casting the room in momentary shadow. In that brief darkness, I saw the weight Dominic carried. Responsibility for his pack, for all the territories that looked to him for protection, for the decisions that would determine whether peace or war prevailed. And somehow, impossibly, I had become central to that outcome. What happens now? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Dominic's silver eyes held mine. Now, Iris Blackwell, you decide who you want to be. The girl your stepmother convinced you was nothing special, or the woman who brought 9 people back from death's threshold, the healer who might save us all. 3 days later, I stood at the highest point of Ravencrest's eastern tower, watching the sun set behind distant mountains. My strength had returned almost completely, a recovery the healers called miraculous, though I knew it had more to do with Dominic's energy than any miracle. The Alpha King had been a constant presence during my recuperation, sometimes speaking about pack matters, sometimes sitting in companionable silence as I read from the ancient texts he'd brought from the library. In those quiet moments, something had shifted between us. The formal distance he'd maintained since my arrival had given way to a cautious intimacy, his hand lingering when passing me a book, his eyes seeking mine across the room. Conversations that wandered from politics to personal histories with increasing openness, yet he had not pressed me for an answer about remaining at Ravencrest permanently. True to his word, he was giving me space to decide my own path, even as reports arrived daily of growing unrest along the southern borders. I thought I might find you here, Sarah's voice interrupted my thoughts as she emerged onto the tower platform. Lydia mentioned you'd been asking about the best vantage points. I smiled, grateful for her company. Over the weeks, Sarah had become the closest thing to a friend I had at Ravencrest. I wanted to see the borders for myself, to understand what we're facing. If she noticed my use of we rather than you, she didn't comment. Instead, she moved beside me at the stone parapet, pointing toward the southern horizon where mountains gave way to rolling hills. The border villages you helped heal were there, along that river valley, she said. Valen's territory begins beyond the ridgeline, though his forces have been pushing farther north with each attack. I studied the landscape, trying to imagine the lives being lived in those distant settlements. People who had never met me yet, whose fates were somehow intertwined with mine, through ancient prophecies and opposing powers. Dominic believes Valen will attack Ravencrest directly, I said, voicing the fear that had been growing since I'd awakened. That's why the council wants me to stay permanently. Sarah nodded, her expression grave. Valen has been gathering his forces for weeks. Our scouts report movements that suggest he's preparing for something larger than the border skirmishes we've seen so far. And they think I can stop him. It wasn't a question. They hope you can help, Sarah corrected gently. No one expects you to face him alone, Iris, especially not Dominic. A breeze lifted my hair, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke from the valley below. In the weeks since leaving my home pack, I'd changed in ways I was only beginning to recognize. Standing taller, speaking with more confidence, embracing abilities I'd never known I possessed. The invisible girl who had hidden in shadows now stood in the fading sunlight, seen and valued in ways Veronica could never have imagined. What would you do? I asked Sarah, curious about her perspective as a woman who had carved her own place in a world dominated by male strength. If you were in my position? She considered the question seriously, her dark eyes scanning the horizon before returning to meet mine. I would remember that choosing to fight alongside those you care for isn't the same as being used as a weapon. A slight smile softened her features. And I would recognize when someone looks at me the way Dominic looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Heat rose to my cheeks. He needs my abilities, that's all. Sarah's laugh was unexpectedly warm. Iris, Dominic is the Alpha King. He commands the strongest warriors in all territories. What he needs is power and strength, both of which he has in abundance. Her expression grew more serious. What he wants, what I believe he has been searching for without realizing it, is someone who balances that strength with compassion, someone who heals rather than destroys. Before I could respond, the warning horn sounded from the southern watchtower. 3 long blasts that echoed across Ravencrest, followed by 2 short ones. Sarah stiffened beside me, her hand moving instinctively to the weapon at her hip. "What does that signal mean?" I asked, though the dread in her expression told me it was nothing good. "Attack imminent," she replied, already moving toward the stairs. "We need to get you inside, now." We descended the tower rapidly, emerging into a courtyard filled with organized chaos as warriors prepared for battle. Dominic stood at the center, issuing commands with calm authority that belied the gravity of the situation. His eyes found mine immediately, relief flashing across his features before he returned to directing the defense. Sarah guided me toward the main hall, where Lydia was organizing the non-combatants, elders, children, and those whose skills lay in healing rather than fighting. When she saw us, she beckoned me to her side. "Valen's forces have broken through the outer patrols," she explained without preamble. "They'll reach Ravencrest within the hour. Dominic wants you in the secure chamber beneath the east wing." "I should be with the healers," I protested. "If there are injured, you are too valuable to risk." Lydia cut me off, her expression softening slightly at my obvious frustration. "Iris, listen carefully. Valen isn't coming with an army to conquer Ravencrest. He's coming for you." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through my consciousness. "Me? But why would he?" "Because you represent the only true threat to his power," she explained, leading me toward a hidden staircase behind a tapestry. "The prophecy speaks of balance, light and dark, life and death. If you and Dominic stand together, Valen's darkness cannot prevail." As we descended into the stone passageway, torches flickering on the walls, I pieced together what she wasn't saying. "You think he wants to drain my energy? To take my healing power for himself?" Lydia's silence was confirmation enough. We emerged into a circular chamber carved directly into the mountain beneath Ravencrest. Ancient symbols covered the walls, wolves, moons, spiraling patterns that seemed to pulse with subtle energy. At the center stood a stone pedestal where a single object rested, a ceremonial knife with a hilt carved from the same pale wood as my pendant. "This chamber was built by the first Alpha King," Lydia explained, her voice taking on a reverent quality. "It's a place of power, protected by old magic that even Valen cannot easily breach." I approached the pedestal, drawn to the knife that seemed to resonate with the pendant against my chest. "What is this place really for?" Lydia watched me with knowing eyes. "It is a place of choice, Iris, where those with your gift can decide how to use it." A realization dawned, bringing with it both clarity and fear. "You want me to bind my power to Ravencrest, to Dominic. I want you to understand your options," she corrected. "Your mother faced a similar choice once. She chose a different path, to live a quieter life with your father, to hide her abilities rather than use them in the larger conflict that was brewing even then." "And you think that was wrong?" I asked, defensive of my mother's memory. Lydia sighed, suddenly looking every year of her considerable age. "I think she chose love and family over duty. I cannot fault her for that." Her gaze met mine steadily, but her choice meant that when Valen's power emerged, there was no balance to counter it. The result has been years of growing darkness. Above us, I could hear the distant sounds of preparation for battle, the clatter of weapons, the movements of warriors taking their positions. Soon, Valen's forces would arrive, and Dominic would stand against them, powerful, but potentially facing an enemy who could drain life with a touch. What exactly would binding my power to Dominic do? I asked, my fingers tracing the symbols carved into the stone wall. It would create a connection between your energies, Lydia explained. Your healing ability would strengthen his natural alpha power. His strength would protect you from depleting yourself completely when healing others. She paused, watching my reaction carefully. It would also create a bond that Valen could not break or drain. Your energies would be accessible only to each other. The implication was clear, a bond that went beyond political alliance, beyond the traditional pack bonds. Something permanent and intimate that would tie my fate to Dominic's irrevocably. And if I choose not to, I kept my voice steady, though my heart raced. Then you remain as you are, a powerful healer, but vulnerable. And Dominic faces Valen without the balance the prophecy speaks of. Lydia's expression remained neutral. The choice must be yours, Iris. Freely made. A sudden commotion echoed from above. Shouts, the clash of metal, the unmistakable sounds of battle beginning sooner than expected. Lydia tensed, moving toward the staircase. I must go. Whatever you decide, remain here until someone comes for you. She paused at the entrance. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, Iris. Remember that. Then she was gone, leaving me alone in the ancient chamber with the ceremonial knife and the weight of a decision I never could have imagined making. When I'd stood invisible in the shadows of the mating ceremony weeks ago, I paced the circular room, my thoughts churning. The wooden pendant seemed to grow warmer against my skin with each circuit, as if responding to the energy of the place. I thought of my mother, of the choice Lydia said she had made. Love over duty. Had she regretted it in those final days as the epidemic ravaged our pack? Or had the knowledge that her daughter would someday face this same choice been comfort enough? Be brave when the moon calls. The sounds of battle grew louder above. Without windows, I couldn't tell how much time had passed, but the increasing intensity suggested Valen's forces had breached Ravencrest's outer defenses. Somewhere up there, Dominic was fighting, for his territory, for his people, for a balance I might help restore. I closed my eyes, placing my palm against the stone wall. To my surprise, I could feel energy thrumming beneath the surface, ancient and powerful, responding to my touch as if it recognized something in me. The wooden pendant at my throat grew hotter, almost painfully so, and I gasped as images suddenly flashed through my mind. My mother, younger than I remembered her, standing in this very chamber, her hand clasped with my father's as they made their choice to leave. Dominic, his face unmarked by the scar he now bore, watching them go with resignation and understanding in his silver eyes. A darkness spreading slowly over the territories in the years that followed, villages falling, life force being drained to feed one man's insatiable hunger for power. I staggered back from the wall, breathing hard as the visions faded. It hadn't been just a prophecy or legend. Dominic had known my mother personally, had respected her choice to leave with my father, even as he'd watched the consequences unfold over the years that followed. And now, history was repeating itself with her daughter. A crash from above, louder than the rest, jolted me from my thoughts. The battle was intensifying. Without conscious decision, I found myself moving toward the staircase, drawn by some instinct I couldn't name. I paused at the bottom step, torn between the safety of the chamber and the pull to be where I was needed. The pendant burned against my skin, and suddenly my mother's final words made perfect sense. The moon called not just in the celestial body that guided our kind, but in moments of choice. Crossroads where courage determined the path forward. I turned back to the pedestal, picking up the ceremonial knife. Its wooden hilt seemed to mold to my palm, as if made for me specifically. Perhaps it had been. Perhaps my mother had known this moment would come when she carved my pendant in her final days. Decision made, I ascended the stairs, emerging into chaos. Warriors fought throughout the corridors of Ravencrest, the clash of weapons and snarls of partial shifts filling the air. I moved against the walls, using the shadows that had once been my constant companions to avoid the worst of the fighting. Instinct guided me toward the great hall, where I knew Dominic would make his stand. As I approached, A figure stepped into my path. Sarah, blood streaking her face from a cut above her eye. "Iris!" she gasped. "You should be in the protected chamber." "Where is Dominic?" I demanded, ignoring her concern. Something in my expression must have conveyed the gravity of my purpose, for she merely pointed toward the main doors, the courtyard. "Valen breached the gates. They're fighting there." I nodded my thanks and continued forward, the ceremonial knife clutched in my hand. Outside, rain had begun to fall, a steady, cold downpour that turned the courtyard to mud and slicked the stone steps with treacherous moisture. In the center of the open space, two figures circled each other. Dominic, his clothing torn and bloody but his stance unwavering, and a man I could only assume was Valen. Even from a distance, I could sense the wrongness emanating from the southern leader. Where Dominic's presence had always felt like controlled power, Valen radiated a sickly energy that seemed to corrupt the very air around him. His movements were unnaturally quick, his body somehow too thin yet corded with strength that seemed stolen rather than earned. As I watched, Valen lunged forward, his hand striking out toward Dominic's chest. The Alpha King dodged, but not quickly enough to avoid a glancing blow to his shoulder. Immediately, Dominic staggered, his face paling as Valen's touch drew energy from him. The same energy he'd been sharing with me during my recovery. Without thought, I moved forward, the rain soaking through my clothes as I stepped into the open courtyard. Warriors from both sides paused in their fighting, attention drawn to my appearance. Valen turned, his unnaturally bright eyes widening as he sensed what I was, the healer. He breathed, his voice carrying despite the rain. "How convenient of you to deliver yourself to me." Dominic's head snapped toward me, horror and fear replacing the pain on his face. "Iris, no! Get back inside!" But I continued forward, the ceremonial knife held loosely at my side, the wooden pendant burning against my rain-soaked skin. Valen's lips curved in a smile that held no warmth, only hunger. "I've waited a long time to meet a true healer," he said, stepping away from Dominic toward me, to taste that particular energy. "You'll never touch her," Dominic growled, moving to place himself between us despite his weakened state. Valen laughed, a sound that scraped against my nerves like shattered glass. "Your protection means nothing, Alpha King. Her power calls to mine, opposite but connected. It's the natural order of things." I stepped around Dominic, my eyes fixed on Valen. "You're right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It is the natural order, balance. But you've corrupted that balance, taking what isn't freely given." Something flickered in Valen's two bright eyes, uncertainty perhaps at my lack of fear. "Power is taken, not given," he spat. "A lesson your mother never learned." The mention of my mother should have angered me, but instead, it brought clarity. I glanced at Dominic, meeting his silver eyes that now showed understanding rather than fear. He had recognized my purpose the moment I emerged from Ravencrest with the ceremonial knife. "You're wrong," I said to Valen, raising the knife. Before he could react, I drew the blade across my palm, not deeply, but enough to draw blood that mingled with the rain. True power is always freely given. I turned to Dominic, extending my bleeding hand. "I choose to stand with you," I said, the words carrying the weight of formal ritual. "My strength to yours, your strength to mine." Balance restored, Dominic's expression transformed. Relief, wonder, and something deeper that made my heart race. Without hesitation, he took the knife and made a similar cut across his own palm, then clasped my hand in his, our blood mingling as the rain washed over us. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Energy surged between us, the wooden pendant glowing with sudden brightness that illuminated the courtyard despite the storm. I felt Dominic's strength flowing into me, not draining him as Valen's touch had, but shared freely, creating a circuit that amplified both our powers. Valen howled with rage, lunging toward us with unnatural speed. But as he reached for us, the energy connecting Dominic and me flared brighter. Valen's fingers brushed my shoulder, and he screamed, recoiling as if burned. "What have you done?" he demanded, clutching his hand, which now bore a mark like a brand where he had touched me. Understanding dawned in Dominic's eyes. "The binding works both ways," he said, his voice carrying the authority of the Alpha King. "You cannot take what is freely given to another." Valen snarled, his features contorting with fury and desperation. He attacked again, this time aiming for Dominic, perhaps hoping the binding was not yet complete. But where their skin connected, the same burning effect occurred, driving Valen back with a howl of pain. "It's over, Valen," Dominic said, our hands still joined, the energy between us stabilizing into a warm, steady flow. "Your power cannot touch us now. And without the ability to drain others, you're nothing." Fury twisted Valen's features into something barely recognizable as human. With a scream of rage, he shifted, not to wolf form as I expected, but into something monstrous, a corrupted version of our kind that spoke of how deeply he had perverted the natural order. He launched himself at us in a final, desperate attack. Dominic moved with the enhanced speed our bond now granted him, pulling me behind him even as he met Valen's charge. Their bodies collided with a force that shook the ground beneath our feet. What followed happened so quickly I could barely comprehend it. Dominic's hands grasping Valen's twisted form, our shared energy flowing through the Alpha King and into his enemy. But instead of draining or harming, the energy seemed to cleanse, burning through the corruption Valen had cultivated over years of stealing life from others. Valen collapsed to the ground, his body returning to human form, but diminished. Thin, frail, as if all the stolen energy had been purged from him in an instant. He lay gasping in the mud, his unnatural brightness faded to dull embers. "Take him to the cells," Dominic commanded his warriors, who moved forward cautiously to secure the fallen leader. "He'll face the council's judgment for his crimes." As Valen was dragged away, the fighting around us ceased. Southern warriors, seeing their leader defeated, began laying down their weapons. The rain eased to a gentle patter, then stopped altogether, allowing weak sunlight to break through the clouds. Dominic turned to me, our hands still joined, the cuts already healing with unnatural speed thanks to our shared energy. His free hand rose to cut my cheek, his thumb brushing away raindrops that might have been tears. "You came back," he said simply. "You chose to stay. I chose you," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." Understanding and something deeper warmed his silver eyes. "Your mother would be proud of the choice you made today. As am I." "She guided me here," I said, touching the wooden pendant that had cooled against my skin. "She knew this day would come, even if she chose a different path for herself." Dominic nodded, his expression solemn. "Helen made her choice for love, as did you." The word hung between us, unspoken, yet acknowledged in the way his fingers tightened around mine, in the steady flow of energy that bound us together more intimately than any formal ceremony could have done. Around us, Ravencrest began to recover from the battle. Warriors helping the wounded, servants emerging to assess the damage, council members gathering to discuss what would happen next with the southern territories now leaderless. But for this moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us, standing in the aftermath of a storm, both literal and figurative. "What happens now?" I asked, echoing the question I'd posed days earlier in his chambers. A smile touched Dominic's lips, not the controlled, careful expression he showed the council, but something warmer, more personal. "Now, Iris Blackwell, you take your rightful place, not in shadows, but in light. As healer, as partner, as my equal in all things." He leaned forward, his forehead touching mine in a gesture of intimacy that held more meaning than the grandest declaration. "If that is what you want," he added softly. In answer, I rose on tiptoes, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that sealed our bond more definitively than blood or ancient ritual. His arms encircled me, drawing me against the solid warmth of his chest as he returned the kiss with a tenderness that belied his strength. When we parted, I saw our future unfolding with sudden clarity, not as alpha and consort in the traditional sense, but as partners bringing balance to territories long divided by fear and power. The healing of land and people alike would be slow, requiring both his strength and my compassion, his authority and my understanding. "I want all of it," I said, meeting his silver gaze without hesitation. "The responsibility, the challenges, the chance to build something better than what came before. I smiled, feeling truly seen for perhaps the first time in my life, and you, especially you. 6 months later, I stood on the same tower where I had watched the sunset with Sarah on the day of Valen's attack. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and below, Ravencrest bustled with activity as delegates from all territories, including the southern packs now led by a council rather than a single alpha, gathered for the seasonal summit. Much had changed since that rainy day, when Dominic and I had formed our bond. The territories were healing, both literally and figuratively, as I worked with healers throughout the packs to share the knowledge contained in Ravencrest's ancient texts. Valen himself, stripped of his stolen power, had been exiled beyond the mountain ranges, his fate a warning to any who might be tempted to follow his path. My father had recovered enough to travel to Ravencrest for our formal mating ceremony 2 months prior. His health improved beyond what conventional medicine could explain. Perhaps my mother's healing gift had passed to him through our years together, or perhaps simply being freed from Veronica's influence had allowed his natural strength to return. Either way, he now served as an advisor to the joint councils, his experience bridging the gap between central authority and outlying packs. Veronica and Olivia had not attended the ceremony, though I'd sent an invitation out of newly discovered confidence rather than any desire for reconciliation. Their absence had been a relief rather than a disappointment. Some wounds were better left to heal from a distance. Footsteps behind me announced Dominic's arrival. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. Our bond allowed me to sense his presence, to feel the steady strength that had become my foundation in this new life. "The delegates are asking for you," he said, coming to stand beside me at the parapet. "Apparently, my diplomatic skills are insufficient without my mate's moderating influence." I smiled, leaning against his solid warmth. Translation: "The Southern representatives are being difficult again. They're afraid of change," Dominic sighed. "After generations of fear and oppression under Valen and his predecessors, they don't quite believe in the possibility of balance." "Then we'll show them," I said simply, turning to face him. "Day by day, decision by decision, until they see that strength doesn't have to come at the expense of compassion." Dominic's hand rose to touch the wooden pendant I still wore daily, a reminder of where I'd come from and the mother whose legacy I now carried forward in my own way. The scar on his palm matched mine, both long healed, but permanently marked from the binding that had changed everything. "You've already shown them more than you realize," he said, his silver eyes warm with pride and love. "The invisible girl who stepped out of the shadows to save us all." I stretched up to kiss him briefly, still marveling at the ease between us that had grown with each passing day. "We saved each other," I corrected gently. "That's what balance means." Together, we descended from the tower to rejoin the summit, his hand steady at the small of my back, my presence softening his commanding aura into something that inspired trust rather than just obedience. The wooden wolf pendant rested against my heart, no longer burning with urgent purpose, but warm with the quiet certainty that I had answered the moon's call with all the bravery my mother had wished for me. And in doing so, I had found not just purpose or power, but the belonging I'd always sought, visible, valued, and loved not despite my differences, but because of them.